Now, the other distorted view of reality is what we were doing in Libya and why. So we have not been given correct information. And basically, if you knew what I have found out over the last 1,500 or 2,000 hours of study, you would realize that the White House and the media both took you into a war that's going to have potential reverberation on millions of people's lives without letting you have the information to advocate or understand whether war or peace was in your behalf. So in the beginning, there's the big Benghazi lie. So the big Benghazi lie, right? The outbreak during the Arab Spring in Benghazi on February 17th, I believe, 2011. There was a few hundred people killed in an uprising where they obtained weaponry. But the rebels never amassed to more than 3,000 people, and I was supporting them at the time, and I was very puzzled how few of the sons these regions were giving to the conflict. And then later on, it all became much clearer. But I noticed something was wrong right then and there. Gaddafi was rolling them back up into Benghazi. He had made various martial, spirited speeches, which could be viewed as with bravado about straightening out the people in Benghazi. And this was gleefully glommed onto by the Western rulers and media to justify what they were about to do. So they got the UN Resolution 1973, which said there was no arming of either side, for example. There was to be no fly. In fact, the Allies flew people back and forth between the mountains where the indigenous Amazigh Berber people lived, and to coordinate with the jihadists in Benghazi. So they're basically, four or five different groups that represented the opposition. There was various cities, states, and tribal groups and configurations that were aligned against the Gaddafi aligned tribes and groups. So, for example, Misratans hate Warfalans of Beni Walid and the vice versa. And the Beni Walid is the last stronghold of Gaddafi loyalists. So, this Benghazi lie also consisted of rapidly circulating unverified rumors gleefully. Again, this is like grist for some kind of mill. Absolutely. If you study the papers over the year, they will print any nonsense they could get to discredit Gaddafi and justify the war. So basically what I wanted to show you, you may not be able to see it very well, but so I'll just make a red box everywhere. So Benghazi on February 17th, I believe, that was the day of the uprising. We were never told the background on Libya. We were never told Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa, that actually Gaddafi did have support, that actually we were in league with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who were pushing a very virulent form of anti-women Islam, and now they're shoving it down the people in Libya's throats by destroying their shrines, burning libraries of saints of the Sufis, desecrating graves, having to hide Roman statues, all of these sort of phenomena, because they're actually pushing the Saudis and Qataris who armed the Islamists in Libya, who were basically, the Qataris and the Islamists were 80% of the rebels, although you might want to look at Misrata a bit differently, the city-state of Misrata. Okay, so Benghazi broke out. When we made the decision to put in UN 1973 resolution to create a ceasefire and a no-fly zone to lead to peace talks, the background is we were never told a number of important things about Libya, which if you stay tuned and I describe to you, you'll realize we had to know, regardless of how you feel about the facts that are not being discussed, meant what is about to be described. So we sabotaged the talks with Gaddafi by requiring him to already be gone before we talked to him as a precondition. It's obviously a very high-handed precondition. A very high-handed precondition that is meant not to encourage peace, but absolute obedience and surrender and prostration, as you still may be killed and jailed, or your destruction. Let's see here. Sabotage of diplomacy by saying he has to leave and that he cannot be there, he has to go, and in fact, how can you be in negotiations with somebody who's gone? And this put into the balance peace and conquest as the two options for the U.S. after UN 1973 was enacted. And instead of choosing a path of peace, which is one where you're not in total control, because you don't have a gun right up to their head at that very second, you would have to at least ready the weapon. But the advantage of peace is no one gets killed. And you can always start a war anytime you want. But this was not tried. Anybody who says it was is full of it. But the funny thing is that, I thought these people were evil, but I think a lot of them actually believe their own bile. So the question is, the decision to go into war mode has created horrible blowback. And so I will go through the blowback articles. So first of all, if you should have any doubt that the Libyans were ready to negotiate elections immediately by June, this came out on July 3rd of last year, 5 months before his dad died, roughly, 4.5. Lui qui promet de bâtir une nouvelle Libye, se dit ouvert aux négociations avec l'OTAN et les rebelles depuis plusieurs semaines. You want democracy? You want democracy? You want democracy done. You want election done. New constitution done. There were reformists such as Saif al-Islam in Libya prior to this uprising. But let's not get caught away from ourselves. The key question, this is evidence that we probably could have tried peace. And I maintain we didn't. And the South African protester that I saw actually put it best in my mind. He said, the West is bloodthirsty. They can only understand violence. They do not understand diplomacy. And this did seem to be the case. The mission probably ended up killing around 30,000 Libyans. And Libya has a population in New York City, so 10 times more than 9/11 in New York. And there's also 10,000 people being held without charges, many of which are being tortured. There's the beginning of muzzling of women after women had legal equal rights under the socialist Gaddafi Jamahiriya state. We took a military response to a diplomatic problem, yet here, ironically, ultimately, was the diplomats who died. The State Department under Clinton has adopted a very aggressive stance, eschewing diplomacy for violence in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Palestine, Yemen, and Libya. Was it arrogance or ignorance? And also ironic is that Gaddafi himself came to power in a bloodless coup, when for us to achieve this change nearly destroyed their country. So Gaddafi actually just drove a tank in 1969, apparently, into the king's quarters and demanded he abdicate, and he did so. And this, incredibly, seems to be an actual truth. And then there was a young officers' circle that was very popular until about 1975 that drove literacy up sharply, every metric of sharply. Libya was not a poor country. It was a police state, I would hazard to say. They had a small prison population, a quarter of the U.S. incarceration rate. Will the West ever take responsibility for the consequences of its violent, diplomacy-free, humanitarian intervention? How is dropping bombs humanitarian? How is the big lie of a hypothetical massacre in Benghazi that might have taken place justification for the events that have transpired? In actual fact, the passing of UN Resolution 1973 is not really the issue. The issue is the abuse of the resolution. The idea of halting hostilities at the edge of Benghazi is a separate issue one can debate. But this issue is one of taking a resolution designed to lead to peace and forcing it to go to war. So, who made this decision? And did they realize that the blowback would include destabilizing all of North Africa with Al Qaeda like groups stimulated with weapons? The Tuaregs turned out of Libya, who were actually, the Tuaregs were, Gaddafi had more broad based support than people think, because actually, the Tuaregs were not even in my list of pro Gaddafi units. I mean, all of these other guys down here in the southwest were pro Gaddafi practically, except for the Tuareg, and here they were ending up aligned with him after the NATO intervention. This area was not at all allied to Gaddafi, and here Beni Walid is holding out. It turns out the people who held up the airport a couple of months ago were in fact Gaddafi loyalists. They penetrated the intelligence service. They've done bombs, and many of these ethnic conflicts inside Libya are deliberately being dumbed down so that we don't get to know that they're Gaddafi loyalists. Nobody with actual training gets to examine this information and say, these people are traditionally allied with Gaddafi or currently are. Nobody knows. They're just two different tribes. And so we have to go out and scrape this information off. It's just shameful, because the key bedrock issue for the Libyan future, from a stability point of view, regardless of your feelings about the intervention, which 10 out of 10 Arab countries all opposed when polled by Gallup, which didn't even bother to poll Libya. But anyways, you see here we have the Warfala. They were aligned towards Gaddafi after NATO intervention, which drove them to be sympathetic with him, whereas previously they were against him when it was still just a civil matter. Many people went over to Gaddafi when it went from a political crisis to a foreign military intervention crisis. The Tarhuna, they were the ones that actually captured the Tripoli airport and are suspected of having been involved with bombings. From the loyalist point of view, then of course the Gaddafi and Syrian, various people in the south here. In theory, elements of Tripoli, definitely. So there is still support for that sympathy, and the defeat of the Islamists in the election. The Islamists were one of the primary parties that was involved in this uprising. Tribes that were alienated from Gaddafi didn't take as much to go over. The other aspect were the remnants of the Libyan Independent Fighting Group. The Libyan Independent Fighting Group were Islamic extremists that waged a bitter civil war in Libya, and Saif al-Islam released them. And then they ended up, ironically, killing his father, or certainly enabling it. So this has been the document I've been maintaining on blowback consequences of this decision to militarize rather than treat diplomatically the